Hi, my name is Rima Laibow, MD, and I'd like to talk to you about how, in the eyes of the government of the United States, the word voluntary actually means mandatory for all practical purposes. Now, last week, the senior officials in the cabal to force vaccinations on the entire U.S. population announced on C-SPAN that there would not be mandatory vaccination. And people who have been concerned about that were then willing to stand down and relax a bit. But the reality is a little bit different. You see, when Health and Human Services Secretary Sebelius and the head of the CDC said that there would absolutely not be mandatory vaccination, that the only vaccinations that Americans would receive would be voluntary ones for the alleged pandemic, the swine flu level 6 pandemic that the World Health Organization declared, they weren't telling you quite the whole truth. We have federal legislation that says that people will indeed be given the opportunity in a pandemic emergency, such as the one that was declared in the United States on April 25th, which was a mere 11 days after the first so-called swine flu death in Mexico. 11 days, and we already had a pandemic emergency. Very strange. And while we're on the subject of strange, don't you think it's strange that Baxter International, the same company that contaminated the seasonal vaccine for flu of 18 countries in Europe, the same 18 countries that Baxter had a contract with, that if they did develop avian flu, then Baxter would be the supplier, that same company, Baxter, was given the lead role in developing the swine flu pandemic, perhaps because they had already filed the patent on the swine flu vaccine way back in 2007. And again, speaking of strange, perhaps it's worth recalling that Novartis, another contender for front runner in the swine flu vaccine sweepstakes, Novartis had its own swine flu vaccine pulled from the market by the FDA for labeling inconsistencies in February of 2009. Now, in the calendar that I have on my desk, 2007 comes before 2009. And in that same calendar, February comes before April. So what we're looking at here is a put-up job. There is no pandemic, but there certainly is a danger of a pandemic vaccine spreading a new pandemic, genetically engineered, as we now know, and causing enormous death and suffering through contamination and through impurities, and those do not seem to be what I would call accidental. So, now we have federal legislation that says in the event of a pandemic, you can be offered a pandemic vaccine, and you have the right to refuse. That qualifies, in my mind, as voluntary. But if you refuse, then you can be held in, quote, provisional quarantine for a very long time. What does provisional quarantine mean? Well, according to the regulations that established this ability of the federal government to carry out these actions against you, provisional quarantine means, in essence, indefinite quarantine until the need for quarantine is established. I would call that being disappeared. Now, under the provisional quarantine regulations, you do have the right to an appeal. but it doesn't say anything about an appeal with an attorney, or an appeal in a speedy fashion, or an appeal that actually is granted. You have the right to request an appeal, not to have one. If you refuse the vaccine that is offered you concerning the swine flu or any other pandemic, once a pandemic emergency has been declared in the United States, you can be held indefinitely in any place that the director of the CDC determines is the right place for that quarantine. Could be a hospital, could be a FEMA camp, could be your home, could be a prison. Nobody knows. And while there, you have no rights. You have the right to habeas corpus, it says, but it doesn't say when that right would be exercised if you asked for a hearing. Now, the situation with the states is a great deal more serious. You see, the Constitution of the United States says that any power not specifically given to the federal government is reserved for the states, and the Constitution of the United States makes no mention whatsoever of public health. So, the states have public health responsibility. In 2002, the Model State Emergency Powers Health Acts were proposed to the states of the United States on the request of the federal government.